Angry protests in Georgia. The parliament has approved a so-called foreign agents bill. Critics say it will steer the country away from democracy by adopting a Russian-style system. So what's next for Georgia, and could this end its aspirations to join the EU? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Tom McRae. Protests and arrests in Tbilisi. Georgia's parliament has signed off on a controversial bill sparking outrage in the capital. In April, the government announced it was reviving legislation that would require media and non-government organisations to register themselves as foreign agents if they receive more than 20% of their funding from abroad. Now, that led to weeks of mass demonstrations. The government says the law is needed to promote transparency and preserve sovereignty. But is it a sign Georgia is moving closer to Russia? And how might it affect the country's hopes of joining the European Union? Now, we'll put those and other questions to our guests in just a moment. But first, this report by Imogen Kimber.
Protesters shut down parts of Georgia's capital, Tbilisi, fighting back against a new law known as the Foreign Agent Bill.
The Georgian government, which is now can be openly called pro-Russian government, decided to switch the direction of our foreign policy towards Russia, and they basically copied the same laws that Putin introduced, so-called Foreign Agent Bill.
The bill will require organisations receiving more than 20% of their funding from abroad to register as agents of foreign influence. They would then be monitored by the Ministry of Justice and can be asked to share sensitive information or potentially face hefty fines. Critics say this will negatively affect media outlets and non-governmental organisations and could be used to stifle free speech and clamp down on the government's political opponents. It's seen as similar to legislation in Russia that's used to oppress opposition. But the government says the law will stabilise the country and overcome foreign influence.
The adoption of the law on transparency of foreign influence creates strong guarantees of long-term peace and tranquility in Georgia and to overcome the so-called polarisation, which is a necessary condition for Georgia's integration into the European Union.
The bill now goes to President Salome Zurabishvili, who has said she will use her veto to block it. But her decision can be overridden by another vote in Parliament, controlled by the Prime Minister's ruling party, Georgian Dream, and its allies. The EU says the bill will damage Georgia's bid to join the bloc, something that is a flashpoint for many protesters.
This law is going to destroy the European future that my country has been fighting for, and the values that their ancestors have been fighting for ages.
The US has warned Georgia not to side with Moscow against the West, threatening sanctions and saying a planned $390 million in assistance would be reviewed. Demonstrations have been held for weeks, with crowds numbering in the tens of thousands. The protests are believed to be the biggest in Georgia since it regained independence from Russia in 1991. And despite a heavy-handed response by police, and with the bill looking set to pass, they don't show any signs of stopping. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Okay, let's bring in our guests now. All of them are joining us from Tbilisi. Hans Gutbrod is a professor of public policy at Georgia's Illia State University. He's been working in the Caucasus region since 1999 in policy research and with think tanks. Ketevan Shoshiashvili is a senior researcher with Transparency International Georgia, which is likely to be seriously impacted by the new foreign agents law. And Dachi Imedadze, who is a campaign strategist with SHAME, a protest movement started after the protests in Georgia in 2019. Thank you so much for joining us here on Inside Story. Hans, if I can begin with you, it really feels like this is one of those moments where everything really is in the balance in Georgia. Can you just give us an idea of how much is at stake right now?
The best way to describe what's at stake is that this is a kind of coup. That is a strong word, but really what's happened in Georgia is that over the years, the courts, the culture sector, a lot of independent institutions have essentially been captured by the government. And the only sector of society that was left standing was civil society. And this law that looks like it's about transparency actually makes it possible for the government to repress essentially any civil society organization it wants. The right way of describing it is it's a repress anyone you want law. It stigmatizes institutions, it opens them up to intrusion, it exposes them to punitive fines, and all of this can be slapped arbitrarily onto civil society organizations. So when you see lots of people protesting, they're not just protesting about a single law. They feel that essentially their country is being taken away from them. And this is what drives people's anger and also people's fear.
Ketevan, is that how it feels in Tbilisi? Your organisation, Transparency International Georgia, is obviously going to be affected by this. What impact is it going to have for you and your organisation?
Thank you. As you might know, this law that was adopted yesterday with 84 votes has nothing to do with the transparency, and is directly targeting civil society organizations and critical media in Georgia. Thus, at this point, this law cannot be considered as a law against only civil society in Georgia, but also a law that is targeting the West and Western support to Georgia. Well, Transparency International is one of the organizations doing a really critical work for Georgia's democracy. Therefore, yes, we'll be pretty much affected by this. But Georgia has a very vibrant, large civic society organizations, and overall, as you can see, they are out in the streets protesting this because they see that the core of this law is not only a narrow target of just civic society, but also Georgia's European future.
If you can just specifically explain how your organisation is going to be impacted.
Well, the law itself envisions to specifically target civic society organizations and critical media by imposing financial sanctions unless they register in a special database as agents. Therefore, organizations like us might be forcefully registered unless they register themselves, and significant financial sanctions will be imposed on those organizations, which is quite critical and big in financial terms for organizations like this.
Yeah. Dachi, as we've seen, huge numbers of people out on the streets protesting in opposition to this. But the government says, and its supporters say, that this law is all about transparency and preventing outside influence on Georgian politics. That can only be a good thing, surely.
Well, definitely. The agenda that they have imposed on their public campaign is about transparency, and their motivation, as they say, is to ensure that the public knows how the civil society organizations are funded and from where. But the real reason behind the law is of course not to have transparency, because the civil society organizations and the NGO sector in Georgia is one of the most transparent sectors in the country. We are required by financial law to provide a financial declaration yearly to the Ministry of Finance about every bit of an operation that our organization does, and this is universal. This is not only about us. So basically, what we are seeing now is the Russian-style, Russian-copied attempt to clear the field from the critical voices of the NGOs who can monitor the elections, who can investigate government's corruption, who can defend people and assist them with legal aid while they are punished by the system, or etc. So what we're seeing now is a very harsh, very violent attack on Georgia's constitutional aims of trying to be integrated within the EU and NATO. Because this law, and this is not only my opinion, as the EU, NATO, every bit of organizations that are Georgia's friends and Georgia's partners, saying that, well, this law will hinder Georgia's European aspirations and Georgia's European perspective. So So this is the situation we are at currently.
Yeah, we'll get on to the impact that this is going to have on its aspirations to join the EU in just a moment. But Hans, can you just give us a bit of an idea, a bit of context about what the government's problem is with outside media organisations and NGOs? Because it really feels like it's not just a distrust or dislike anymore from the Georgia Dream Party. I've read that it's been described as more resentment bordering on hatred. Why is that? Why is the government, I guess, trying to do this? What is it trying to achieve?
What the government's trying to achieve is precisely to shut organizations like Transparency International that Katie works with, to shut them down. If you go onto the website of Transparency International, you can actually find out in something like 20 seconds who funds them, what they do with that funding, how much they receive. But you can also find out rather quickly that there are 150 cases of high-level corruption or allegations of high-level corruption that remain uninvestigated. 30 of those concern MPs. Yesterday, we had the MPs voting in favor, and all of this is just what's known. That means almost certainly there's much more. 30 of other cases concern cabinet-level senior officials, prime minister, ministers, deputy ministers. If you're the government, if you're a corrupt government, you consider institutions that highlight your corruption. Of course, you consider them highly politicized. Most sensible people would consider that's sensible, kind of a necessary work in a functioning democracy. What's really important for people to understand, though, it's not only just about these organizations. It is also today organizations that work on animal rescue, people that try and save cats, people that work with street dogs. They will also be affected, and they say they cannot continue operating. So this will devastate, has the risk of devastating essentially anything that is not state controlled. And that's a very, very big shift. That's a very threatening, very ominous development.
Ketevan, I heard one protester who was out on the streets describe this government and the supporters of this law as a slave to Russia. Does it feel like at this point in time that the country really is moving in that direction, or the government is attempting to move the country in that direction?
Thank you for the question. Absolutely. At this point, with this law, government basically declares that their intention with this law is to go against the West. So right now, the situation is not just about government versus civic society organizations, but it's about government versus the West. This is something that we have witnessed and listened to the speech of the honorary chairman, the oligarch, who is a ruler of Georgia's government and who has been capturing the state for over several years that we have researched at the Transparency International Georgia. And he specifically outlined in his speech 2 weeks ago that he sees the West as adversaries. Therefore, this law goes beyond a very narrow view of just attacks on civic society organizations in Georgia, but therefore it is a very alarming trend of Georgia's policy shift towards Russia. And this is exactly why we see protests being this massive and nonstop for a month now.
Yeah, Dachi, just on the protests, watching from the outside, it feels like there's an intensity and a passion there from the protesters. Can you just explain why young people in particular are so incensed by this law?
Yes, I would agree to the description that you just said. I do think that the reason behind the youngsters being so active in the protest and basically being the core of the whole movement is because that, including me, we were born in a free Georgia. We were born in an independent country that was free out of the Soviet regime, and it could set its own rules and principles of how do we live. Right, and my generation has experienced at times when we, as a country, grew quite rapidly. We had new opportunities to get education, to get new jobs, to travel to Europe and other countries, to basically be part of the global world which we couldn't have been years before. So I do think that the young generation is concerned about losing all of this, about losing being part of the civilization, Western civilization as a whole, and somehow being more into the camp of Russia and other authoritarian countries like Belarus and others. I do think that people perceiving that this is the pivotal moment when Georgia either goes towards Europe and gets its own national mission accomplished, or gets back to its past while being with Russia, is right now, and we are at the crossroads.
Yeah, Hans, just on that point, a part of the country is still under Russian control. Does the Georgian government have to keep that in mind here as well, as they're clearly not part of NATO or the EU, and they don't have the protection that those organisations offer? So does Georgia have to be careful here, do you think?
Georgia has traditionally and for centuries has been in a challenging spot, so to speak, between big powers. In the past, in the last 30 years, when Georgia faced severe crises, what it often did was it worked with Western friends and partners, and it worked with the people that actually brought, if you will, goodwill to this. And I think it's fair to say that maybe that's not the case around the world, that people look at the West and the United States and EU in a kind of very positive way. But here in the Caucasus, I think it's really fair to say it's been overwhelmingly a positive influence. And the experience with Russia has been very, very bad. That's maybe something you don't see from the outside. But, Georgians have been killed in these occupied territories quite recently, in recent years, with total impunity. And therefore, for them, for many people, they want ultimately to work with the West. That you need to maybe somehow, you're in a difficult neighborhood, sure. You need to kind of navigate that. That's something that lots of countries need to do. But essentially, the West in the past and Western friends and partners have been there and once worked together with them. And so to speak, if you kick all of that off the board, then you're not even doing balancing anymore. You're just going all the way in one side. And this is again, this bodes very badly for the future. Everyone who's critical knows that Western societies are also in need of improvement, but very few people think that Russia is the kind of place you really want to live.
Yeah.
And this is what this is about.
Yeah. I also want to talk about the billionaire that has been called the Puppet Master of Georgian politics. Ketevan, he helped form the Georgia Dream Party, Bedzina Ivanishvili. He accumulated his wealth in Russia. He's got close ties, obviously, still there now. How large is his influence within Georgia politics?
From the very beginning, he indeed had significant influence on Georgia's government. He, in fact, also had a public post. He was a prime minister of Georgia, and he has left politics a couple of times, and it was the final third comeback of his by the end of January last year, when he declared that he was needed back in politics, in Georgian politics. Well, we have been researching and exposing his influence, and in 2021 we have concluded that at this point the influence of the oligarch is so big that we can openly say that the state is captured. And if we take a look at the different branches of the government, the cabinet and the ministers that we have in Georgia, everyone who's in the role of government authority is either connected with him with the business interests, or they are coming from his Kartu Bank. That is something really important, as in assets, eventually assets in Georgia. On the other hand, what we see is that government officials through different years in Georgia are loyal to the oligarch, and the policies and the statements that are coming from there are pretty much aligned to what oligarch and his interests do need.
Yeah. Hans, just staying on this for a moment, I think 3 of the last 4 prime ministers have been former managers of his company. So do you think that he really is the puppet master pulling the strings behind the scenes here? And what is his end goal?
I think the best way to describe him at this point is like the Macbeth of the Caucasus. He he's a reclusive man. He's actually not very active day to day. While he pulls some strings, he then often lets other things kind of fall by the wayside, so to speak. And I think in the end, he's a man who's trapped in a maze of his own making, so to speak, and who is unsure about his own future and has grown bitter and resentful and now lashes out. And in many ways, I think is someone who's run out of ideas and has run out of people, and now thinks that he needs to go after people that could actually pose a challenge, which is why Macbeth, so to speak, is the right comparison here.
Okay. Dachi, I want to get on to the EU membership. You mentioned this before. Obviously, an overwhelming number of Georgians want to join the European Union. This new law definitely impacts that. I mean, it feels like at this point in time, the protesters are protesting just as much about the possibility that they might not be able to join the EU as they are about the law itself. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, exactly. I would describe the situation just as you said. People are fairly concerned that this law is a direct threat to Georgia's European way and all the progress that we have made throughout the years. For 30 years, Georgia has been slowly and step by step trying to get closer to the Western institutions like EU and NATO. And during the past few years, we made a significant progress, like having an association agreement with the EU, a visa-free regime, and also last year attaining the candidacy status. So we're at the critical stage of getting to the next stage, which is the accession negotiations, accession talks with the EU. And as far as I know, we would have our answer about whether we are getting to the next stage or not at the end of the year. So this comes at a very critical junction of time when every step of the government, every law that they make and adopt will definitely influence the European progress and European way. And especially with this legislation that is directly attacking the West, demonizing them and trying to register the West as an enemy in public mind, in public consciousness, because that's what they do. I think a lot of the protest members have tried to somehow argue with the Georgian dream and its supporters that at least we should have the differentiation between Russia and the West, our friends, our partners. But they blankingly say that, well, no, this is all about foreign powers, and every foreign power, no matter who they are, is danger to Georgian society.
Yeah, there's elections coming up in I think 5 months' time in October. Do you think that this is short-sighted, Ketevan, from the government, that it's just going to push people away from voting for them and to opposition parties?
Well, with this law, in the coming elections, government is trying to suppress the critical voices. This is something that is critical to understand about current developments and events in Georgia. Therefore, this is prerequisite for something really something that requires a lot of attention from the West. For these elections in this fall to be free and fair, this is going to be really important in this country because, again, Georgia's European future is at stake at this point. This is also appealed by the people on the streets, and therefore these elections are core to be saved and to be held free and fair. Although this law is not helping this, people are on the streets to try to defend it.
Yeah. Hans, I know you've observed every Georgian election since 1999. You've been obviously keeping a very close eye on the politics in Georgia for the last 25 years. Can you give us a sense of what you think is going to happen over the next 5 months and through that election period?
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say typically elections in Georgia, they're not a level playing field. They're already kind of a warped playing field. And this law will tilt it further. It'll get even more difficult for opposition parties, for people who have different views to actually have an impact with everything else that goes on. It's also, I think, one thing that's really important to mention to people that look at this from the outside. They might think, well, if the government's elected, why shouldn't they be kind of legitimate in doing that? They were elected, they won the last election on the promise of taking Georgia towards the EU, and now they take it exactly in the opposite direction. So that's important to understand. The big worry is that the elections are going to be neither free nor fair. And this is what also drives, if you see very angry scenes from the streets and wonder why aren't people just being peaceful and just waiting for October. That's why, because they feel that this is taking the long-term future, but it may also take any sensible choice away from them in the near term.
Yeah, Dachi, just on that point, as Hans was saying, that it doesn't feel like that these elections could be either free nor fair. So what is going to happen to the hundreds of thousands of people that we have seen out on the streets? Are they going to continue protesting this?
Well, definitely. No matter how the end game of the law is, they accept it, they override the veto, or they take it back and cancel. This doesn't matter anymore, as I do think that the main attitude and main perception within the protest movement is that this is not about the law anymore, but this is about the regime, the Russian regime, and the pro-Russian puppet regime that is trying to drag Georgia away from its European path. So I do think that the people that are on the street today for already a month working tirelessly to voice their opinion as long as they can, they're going to go and vote through the elections as well. I do think that, and I would agree with Hans, that these elections are not going to be, definitely are not going to be free and fair, as these words would mean. But I'm sure at the same time that if a lot of people show up, if we have a record turnout in the history of Georgian elections, which is highly probable because we could do it, then the government would have a very hard time to somehow try to influence the election results. And I would say that we have a pretty good chance of winning it.
Yeah. Hans, in the duration of the show, you've described this law as, and the fallout from it, as a coup. You've said that these elections coming up are not going to be either free nor fair. So just how worried are you, Hans, for the future of Georgia?
The future is already here. That's the challenge. And what's really important to understand for people, this future may be coming near you if you're in a democracy right now, because this is part of an authoritarian wave and a kind of authoritarian playbook that's been rolling out in various places. And that it's not just about Georgia. This is part of a broader battle. If you think that society should be broadly open, then this matters to you.
Thank you so much for all of that. We really do appreciate your time and your insight. Hans, Ketevan and Dachi, thank you so much for joining us here on Inside Story. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Tom McRae, and the whole team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.